Hello out there. We're going to wait a little bit until we can make sure people are settled in and online. Look forward to seeing and talking to you. Oh man, we're getting more and more participants. Thank you for coming. I'm trying to figure out a way I can sneak in ads for the league. Read the Argus. You can get paper. That's our newsletter, or you can get it online, and you can see this in a recording. If it's so scintillating, you want to see it again, and I'm sure it will be. You can go to our website and you can see it online and past Third Thursday online. So looks like we're slowing down on participants, so I think I'm going to start now. I'm Chelsea Kaler, President of the League of Women Voters of Lane County. Welcome to our, I had February down, it's March, third Thursday of 2021, brought to you virtually with the help of Rhonda Livesey and Terry Parker. The League acknowledges we live on the traditional land of the Kalapuya people, whose descendants are citizens of both the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde community and Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians of Oregon. We honor the land and the people who have cared for it and reaffirm our commitment to steward and honor the land through our work. Noting that March is Women's History Month, our honored guest is Lori Erickson, curator of exhibitions and special projects at the Oregon Historical Society. Lori holds both a BA and an MS in anthropology with a focus on archaeology and museum studies. She put together the OHS exhibit titled, Nevertheless, They Persisted, Women's Voting Rights and the 19th Amendment. I bet she can tell some interesting stories she learned while preparing for this exhibit. After her presentation, we'll have time for some questions, so you can begin to ask now via Q&A, and we'll save them for after her presentation. Ms. Erickson, you're up.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. So yes, I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen here, show you some slides. Okay, so I am very pleased to be here discussing the Oregon Historical Society exhibit, Nevertheless They Persisted, Women's Voting Rights in the 19th Amendment. The exhibit was scheduled to open on March 13th of last year, but that was the day that we closed because of COVID restrictions. And so it didn't actually open to the public until July. And then we had to again close in the fall. But now we have recently just reopened. So the exhibit is open for visitation. We are open now on Saturdays and Sundays, so a little bit condensed schedule, but hope to be open in some on additional days of the week very soon. So, and the exhibit is open through December 5th. So hopefully there'll be plenty of time to go see it in person. And I hope you'll feel comfortable doing that. So I thought I could just give you a sneak preview and highlight some of the wonderful artifacts in the exhibit. And then also give you a little background of what it took to put this together, some of the process. So the exhibit ideas came from many different places, but the main idea for this came from a couple OHS staff members who recognized that we had a significant centennial coming up with the 100-year anniversary of the 19th Amendment, which was passed, ratified in 1920. So they suggested that we create an exhibition to commemorate both the event and the women and men who were involved in the fight for women's suffrage. So in early 2019, we began putting together an advisory group of historians with expertise in women's history, women's suffrage history. And we were lucky to find an amazing group of advisors who were not only willing to help, but were very passionate about the subject. So the advisors started meeting with OHS staff several times throughout the process, and we would brainstorm brainstorm content ideas, come up with specific exhibit ideas, object ideas, historical figures that we wanted to include. And after those brainstorming sessions, I would then take all of that information and put it into a content outline. And so that outline really guided us as we moved forward in the structure of the exhibit. And one of the main things too that we also came up with during the brainstorming was the big idea, which is sort of the main message of the exhibit, what we want all of the content to be reinforcing and people to leave with an answer to that question or an understanding of that message. And so the big idea, which we formed in a question for this one, for this exhibit is, how did women and men in America and Oregon in particular persist and achieve women's suffrage and the 19th Amendment? And so we hope that, of course, everything in the exhibit will really support that question and answer that question. So we also, one thing that I started doing early on was researching some potential objects and images that would go in the exhibit. And we have a lot within our own collection at OHS, but I also went to other collections, the State of Oregon Archives, the University of Oregon Archives, the Lewis and Clark College Archives. And so we gathered loans from all those different institutions and used those objects to fill in all the important content pieces. Also early in the process, we started working with a team of designers and fabricators who basically designed the physical structure of the exhibit, the graphics, the look and feel, and then actually built the exhibit. So the exhibit is about 3,000 square feet and it has 13 sections. It is mostly chronological, but it also focuses on some specific topics and subjects such as racism within the movement and the anti-suffrage movement. There's also a timeline with some of the important events that happened in the suffrage movement, starting about 200 years ago and going all the way up to the present time. The most recent one, we have been updating that timeline. So the most recent one is the entry for Kamala Harris and the historic vice presidency. So then we also have a lot of objects, images, projected film, ambient audio, and interactives in the exhibit. And the entire thing is put together on cloth banners and graphic panels and vinyl. So I thought I could start talking about some of the artifacts. One thing to note, because the designs are on banners, on fabric banners, you may, in some of these images, see light shining through some of them. It's really a beautiful effect, I think, the printing on the banners, but there may be a little bit of glare that you see on some of these. So the exhibit begins, the first section begins with the discussion of some reasons why women could not vote in America. And one was the tradition of coverture. That was an idea brought over by the British, and it originated with the French, the Normans in France. And that was that a married woman was a femme couverte, which literally meant a covered woman, because women were considered to be in need of protection and to be provided for by men. So this that you see here is the record of a proceeding from an 18th century American court case where they were judging the ability of a femme couverte in the US to convey property, because women married women were not allowed to own property. Unmarried women could own property if it was passed down to them by a male heir. So some of the traditions that affected women's rights one of them was the concept of Republican motherhood. And this was pervasive among Euro-American families in the colonial times in America and into the 19th century. And it held that women were important in building up the nation, but that there were different spheres of influence, and that women were responsible for the domestic sphere, which was taking care of the household, raising the children, and that men were in charge of the business sphere, the political sphere. So that was something that really affected the idea of citizenship rights. But as time went on, a lot of American women ended up feeling increasingly dissatisfied with their inability to exercise citizenship rights because they believed that they were full citizens or should be full citizens. And they believed that because of that, they already held the same rights as men. So beginning in the mid-1800s, some American women and men began to form different suffrage movements. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton was one of the earliest suffragists, and she and other activists held the first American suffrage convention in Seneca Falls, the Seneca Falls Convention, Seneca Falls, New York, in 1848. And at that convention, Cady Stanton laid out a list of rights demanded by women, the Declaration of Sentiments, and that included the right to vote. But interestingly, that right was the most controversial. A lot of people did not believe that should be one of the rights because they still should believe that women should not be involved in politics. And this document that you see here is a reproduction of the original Declaration of Sentiments from the Library of Congress. So after the Seneca Falls Convention, many more suffrage conventions followed all across the country. And in 1851, Elizabeth Cady Stanton met Susan B. Anthony, an abolitionist from New York, and convinced Anthony to begin working towards women's suffrage and the cause of women's rights. So this began a lifelong partnership where Cady Stanton would be writing articles, books, speeches, and Susan B. Anthony would travel the country giving lectures. This ticket is a wonderful item that we were loaned by Lewis and Clark College. It's an original ticket from a Susan B. Anthony lecture that happened in Oregon in 1871. It was Susan B. Anthony's first visit to Oregon. She visited 3 times total. Over the next 35 years, she visited twice more. And the title of the lecture, Women Already Voters, refers to the fact that women believed that they already had the citizenship rights to vote, that they had voting rights with men, and so they were already voters. So in Oregon, the first suffrage organizations were founded in the early 1870s, first in Albany and Salem, and then in Portland. And this is a record book from 1873 from the OHS collection. And it belonged to Oregon's first statewide suffrage organization, the Oregon State Equal Suffrage Association. It's open to the first page with Abigail Scott Duniway's handwritten bylaws and the names of some of the original members. The first women suffragists in America were also abolitionists. And in the early days, the two movements really worked closely together. So from left to right, you see here up top, Sojourner Truth, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Frederick Douglass, all of whom were women suffragists. But fractures began to form in the movement, leading to the passage of the 15th Amendment in 1870. And that's because some white suffragists were angered that the 15th Amendment meant to aid formerly enslaved people would give voting rights to African-American men, but not to women. And throughout the following years, women of color were often excluded or marginalized by white suffragists who should have been their allies. So as a result, women of color across the country began to start their own suffrage groups to fight for their interests. And even with the 15th Amendment, there were still frequent attempts in many parts of the country to block African Americans from voting. This document is a flyer produced around 1918, and it was produced by one of the national organizations. It specifically shows their efforts to appease the Southern states and convince Southerners that passing a woman's voting amendment would not significantly increase the voting power of African Americans. This is a conference program from the National American Women's Suffrage Association conference. So Western states began moving toward suffrage much earlier than the Eastern states, even though the movement really began in the East, there was more momentum in the West. And that was in part because the Western states had lower population numbers and were really looking to increase their voting power by having more citizens with voting power. So Wyoming Territory became the first in the US to approve suffrage in 1869. And that momentum, because of that momentum out West, the national organizations began to really focus a lot of attention on the West. So in 1905, in conjunction with the Lewis and Clark Exposition and World's Fair, which was held in Portland, the country's largest suffrage association, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, decided to hold their annual conference in Portland in July of 1905. And this is the program, and Susan B. Anthony was a speaker at the conference. And the conference really resulted in an enhanced momentum in Oregon, like a real strong kind of fire got lit because of this, and people started going out and forming all new suffrage organizations across the state, trying to find new strategies to pass the amendment. So there was also a really strong push to use the new referendum system and get the suffrage question on the ballot. It had been on the ballot the first time in 1884, and activists ended up putting it on the ballot 6 times total between 1884 and 1912, which was more times than any other state. And this is about a ballot from 1910, and you can see, can't really read it, but the lower right corner is where the women's suffrage question is on there. So there were many activists that were active in the suffrage fight in Oregon, but the one who was the most active and had the longest struggle was Abigail Scott Duniway. She fought for over 4 decades, beginning in the 1870s, and arguably did more for suffrage for the movement in Oregon than anyone else. She was the one that founded the first statewide suffrage group. She published the first suffrage newspaper in Oregon, and I believe in the Pacific Northwest in general, called the New Northwest, which received national circulation. There's a copy of that. And for more than 40 years, she worked to influence politicians, civic leaders, and was instrumental in getting the suffrage question onto the ballot those several times. I'm personally in awe of how long she fought and hard she fought. It just seems like it would be so easy to give up after 40 years of fighting for the same issue, but she didn't, and she got to see her dream realized when women in Oregon had the right to vote in 1912. So this is her typewriter. that she used to write a lot of letters to local and national leaders. That was like a very common strategy that she used. Was she really spent a lot of time behind the scenes trying to influence people. And so letter writing was a big thing for her. And then there was also, in this case, a trophy that was presented to her by the Rose Festival in 1912 to honor all of her work for suffrage. So as with other movements, there are usually people in opposition, and suffrage was no exception. One thing I was surprised to learn is just the large number of women who were against their own enfranchisement. And Oregon had its own anti-suffrage organization, which included some very influential local women. Because anti-suffragists did not believe women should be involved in politics, they typically spoke out by writing editorials or letters to the editor, or producing flyers or postcards like these. I think in these two, the message seems to be that men would be left at home to do the housework and watch the children while women were out protesting or working. And apparently that was a horrifying scenario. So another thing that I found very interesting was the fact that there were these women that were very staunch anti-suffrage advocates. And so they, you know, had these organizations. They did so much to like try to prevent the suffrage amendment from passing. But when it did, they were some of the first who went out to register to vote. And so we have their voters' registration cards here, so copies of two of the leaders of the anti-suffrage movement in Oregon, Henrietta Failing, who was the curator of the Portland Art Museum, and Catherine McCammon, who was the wife of an Oregon Supreme Court Justice, Wallace McCammon, and she was the leader, the president of the anti-suffrage group. So after more than 40 years of activism, suffragists declared victory in Oregon in 1912. This is a copy of the presentation signed by Governor Oswald West, and he honored Abigail Scott Duniway by asking her to handwrite the words of the proclamation. So that's what this is. After many years of waiting to exercise their right to vote, women quickly began registering to vote in the following months. So voter registration cards belonging to Oregon women are shown here and include Beatrice Moreau Kennedy, which is the second from the bottom. And she was an African-American suffragist who was co-founder and editor of The Advocate, a Black newspaper, Oregon's largest Black-owned newspaper. And the top card belonged to Hattie Redmond. And Hattie Redmond founded a suffrage organization for Black women in Portland. Suffrage also meant that women were eligible to participate in political office. So in 1915, Marion B. Town of Jackson County became the first woman to claim a seat in the Oregon House of Representatives. And Catherine Clark of Douglas County became the first to successfully run for a seat in the Oregon Senate. This is a handwritten acceptance speech given by Sylvia Thompson, Oregon's third female legislator, who was elected in 1916. She ran on a Democratic ticket and for a Wasco County seat in the Oregon House. And she notes in her speech that hereafter there will be no question of sex in the election of legislature. Sorry, excuse me. Hereafter, there will be no question of sex in the election of legislators. So Sylvia Thompson also brought forth the proposed ratification of the 19th Amendment when it came to the Oregon Congress in 1919. Most Western states had achieved suffrage by 1914, but activists were still working for a national amendment that would guarantee suffrage for all. Tactics had changed from working quietly behind the scenes in the 19th century to protests and marches in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. And we have featured in the exhibit this remarkable sash, which is over 100 years old, and it belonged to Oregon attorney Jane Paulson. Her grandmother had worn it in suffrage marches in the 19-teens. After a decade of protests, marches, and even hunger strikes, activists finally achieved their goal in achieving national voting rights for women with the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920. This is a telegram from National American Women's Suffrage Association President Carrie Chapman Catt to Oregon suffrage leader Effie Comstock Simmons, discussing the work to achieve state ratification. Oregon ended up ratifying the amendment January 1920, and then Tennessee became the 36th and final state needed to ratify in August 1920. And as you probably know, Carrie Chapman Catt also founded the National League of Women Voters that same year, and this is her on the right. And the Oregon Equal Suffrage Alliance became the Oregon League of Women Voters with Effie Comstock Simmons as its first president. In this photo, Anna Howard Shaw, who was also a national suffrage leader, is on the left there. So the 19th Amendment passed, and with this text: "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex." But even with the 19th Amendment, it would be decades before all American women could vote. In 1924, the Snyder Act admitted US citizenship to Native Americans, but suffrage continued as a state decision. So Native Americans did not achieve suffrage until about 1962 in all 50 states. This is a photo of Clara Elizabeth Chan Lee, who was born in Portland, and Clara became the first Chinese American woman to register to vote in the US in 1911 after California, she was living in California at the time, after California passed women's suffrage. But Chinese Americans born outside of the US could not vote until the Magnuson Act of 1943. And then that was followed a decade later by the McCarran-Walter Act, which guaranteed all Asian immigrants voting rights through naturalized citizenship. In 1977, Mei Yi became the first Asian American to serve in Oregon's House of Representatives. And in 1982, she won a seat in the state Senate, becoming the first Chinese American in the United States to serve in a state Senate. Even with all of the voting rights legislation, politicians in some areas of the country, particularly the South, have devised ways to block and suppress African American voters in particular, including poll taxes, literacy tests, and physical intimidation. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 forbids states from using the discriminatory practices, but parts of this act have recently, in recent years, been struck down, and many of the racist practices, such as gerrymandering and illegal striking of voters from rolls, continue today across the country. In 1923, suffrage leader Alice Paul proposed the Equal Rights Amendment to ensure equal rights under the law for women. Although women had achieved the right to vote, they still did not have equal rights in all matters with men or stand on equal footing with them. The ERA was not passed by Congress until almost 60 years later, and only last year was ratified by the minimum number of states needed, but it did not meet the deadline for ratification, so it is still not law as of yet. So there still is a lot to work on moving forward. And although we've come a long way and there's been a long fight and many victories, there's still a long way to go. So that is just a brief overview of the exhibit and with some highlights. And I do hope that you'll be able to come see it in person at some point when you feel comfortable. At this point, I would be very happy to take some questions.
Very good. Thank you. That was wonderful. I can't wait to see it in person.
Thank you.
That'll be a highlight. I'm looking forward to it. My daughter's coming here from Tennessee in July, so I hope we can come and see that. So thank you very much. Yeah. We've got some questions going here, not surprisingly, but I'm going to take a privilege here. Oh, well, let's start. What was the name of the Douglas County woman who was one of the first women legislators in Oregon?
I believe that was Catherine Clark. To look back at my notes, but I think Catherine Clark was from Douglas County. Yes, Catherine Clark from Douglas County and Marion B. Town of Jackson County were the first. Catherine was the first in the Oregon Senate and Marion was the first in the Oregon House.
The Douglas County woman, how do you spell her last name?
It's C-L-A-R-K-E.
Okay, Clark. I thought there was a F in the beginning, so that didn't make sense. All right, thank you very much. We do have some more questions. I want to know, this was my personal thing. I want to know what was the most exciting thing you came across? What personally grabbed you?
Yeah, I think there were probably a couple different things. And I think, first of all, just knowing the length of time that some of these women fought for suffrage was just astounding to me. You know, Abigail Scott Duniway fighting for 40 years. She must have just felt, I don't know how you could not feel like giving up. Like, this is never gonna happen. You know, Susan B. Anthony, I think, fought for like 50 years or something. And she, luckily, Abigail Scott Duniway lived to see Oregon women have the right to vote, achieve the right to vote. But Susan B. Anthony never saw that. She never saw that national amendment. So I just think it's kind of heartbreaking, but like also there's so much that we owe to these women. Absolutely. I also think it was really interesting to know about the anti-suffragists. It just never crossed my mind that some women would not want suffrage, that would not want the same rights as men. So it was a culture thing, I guess. Okay, I've got another question. On Wednesday, according to CNN, the House passed a joint resolution that would remove a deadline for states to ratify the ERA. And someone else commented on how fabulous the exhibit looks. So do you know anything about the ERA? Is that the House passed? I don't know, really about this recent thing, but yeah, I do know that it was ratified last year, and that they were still debating, you know, whether that limit would be in effect. But I'm glad to hear that's wonderful news to hear that it may actually finally be a law in our country soon. Fingers crossed. Yeah. You've said it before, but let's tell them again. How long will that exhibit be up? So the exhibit will be up through December, and let me look at the exact date. December 5th. Another interesting question. Do you know whether or not women of color were originally franchised in the 1912 voting rights? They were? Yes. And we know that for a fact because some of the voter registration cards that I had shown in the presentation were African-American women. And so we know that immediately after the passage in 1912, many African-American women registered to vote and voted in Oregon. So And it was the same with the 19th Amendment as well.
And while we're at it, what's the location of the museum?
So the museum is located in downtown Portland, 1200 Southwest Park Avenue. It's right across from the Art Museum, if you know where that is. It's on the park blocks.
Pretty location.
Yeah.
Here's one that you may know the answer to. Can you tell the story about the conflict to gain vote between the brother and who was the editor of the Oregonian and his sister, the suffragist?
Yeah, so there was a disagreement with them. I know that Harvey Scott was Abigail Scott Duniway's brother, and he was the editor of the Oregonian. And I believe at the beginning he was pro-suffrage and was with her, but by the end he had changed his mind and was a pretty fierce advocate of suffrage. And not exactly sure what changed his mind, why that was, but I know it caused some issues with their relationship for sure.
Yeah. The person who asked the question said that OPB had a program on the topic, so maybe the answer's there, and says hope they finish the story. Okay, another question is, did Oregon's colleges and university play any kind of a role in women's suffrage? You know, via public speakers or students demonstrating? Do you know of any?
Yes, I know that there were some of the colleges actually had their own suffrage organizations. So, and I know that they would often host the lectures, you know, when the suffragists would come through town on lecture circuits, they would be at some of the local universities. So I believe that like Lewis and Clark, I think that part of the reason they have a collection there is because of some of that history. So I do know that like there were a lot of college women that were involved, and a lot of on-campus organizations.
I've got a question. All those beautiful banners and pictures that aren't actual artifacts, what will happen to them after?
That's a good question. A lot of times we try to repurpose things and we'll give them to other organizations if they want them. But we try to keep or recycle as much as we can of those.
I think you should auction them off and make money. But,
yeah, I mean, that's a good idea. That's definitely something we'll have to keep in mind.
Wouldn't that be a great mural on a wall? Some of those would be just wonderful. Yeah, that would be great. Another question that's great. What were the positions of religious organizations on women's suffrage?
Yeah, I think that I know the Women's Christian Temperance Union were very strong supporters of suffrage, and a lot of it had to do with wanting to pass prohibition. So there was a big push by a lot of the Christian organizations to pass the suffrage amendments, just because it would give women the voting rights, you know, the power to actually pass the laws that restrict alcohol. So those were hand in hand, although Abigail Scott Duniway did not agree with that. She didn't think that was the reason women should get suffrage, and it also caused a lot of trouble. A lot of the alcohol distributors were like lobbying against women's suffrage because of that, because they were concerned about it.
I was just going to ask, what other organizations were that you could point to that were against suffrage?
That would be the main one that I know about, other than just the like specific anti-suffrage organizations that were just formed for that. But those alcohol lobbyists were like really, they had a lot of power, a lot of money, and they were really, you know, going after the suffrage idea, and, you know, trying to do their best to advertise to make sure that, you know, people were not voting for it. And for a while they were successful. They were like, over time, with all those different ballot measures, the 6 different ballot measures, over time, there was like less support each time until finally it passed in 1912. So.
One of our members comments and says that women gained the right to vote, but it's still a fact that women employees do not earn the same rate of salary as men. And she was employed by OSU when the first effort was made to equalize pay. And I wonder when that was. 60s?
Yeah, it could have been. I know that there was some attempt by that in the progressive era, which was like the 19-teens. There were a lot of like social reforms that were happening at that time. And so it's possible that a more equal wage was something that was proposed during that time. I know that there were other things about like workers' rights with, you know, not with limiting like the workday and limiting the number of hours that people could be required to work and that kind of thing. So,
do you know if there were any hunger strikes of note in Oregon?
I don't know of any hunger strikes in Oregon, no. I think most of that happened back east, and that typically happened later in the teens, the 19-teens, right before the amendment was passed. So that was kind of after like Oregon had the right to vote, women had the right to vote in Oregon. So I don't think there were any hunger strikes that happened here, but it's possible.
You're answering the question so quickly. Oh, I know. One that one of the members asked is, what brought you to this work? What inspired you to do that?
Yeah, so my background is in anthropology, archaeology. So my background is really in museums, and so I have focused on a lot of different topics. I worked for OMSI for 13 years, so I did science exhibit topics, and I think having the archaeology background, you have both the history and the science, and so you know, now I'm kind of more in the history realm, but it was something that I always wanted to do. I've always been fascinated by teaching through material culture and, you know, real objects. And I've always wanted to do that sort of informal education, because I think museums are just such an interesting way to learn and educate people.
There was no moment that like you watched Lara Croft, Tomb Raider or something?
Well, actually, when I was 5 years old, my parents went and saw the King Tut exhibit that was touring in the 70s. I grew up in Chicago. I grew up near Chicago, so they went to see it in Chicago. Mm-hmm. I couldn't go. I was only 5. They didn't want to take me, so they brought back this catalog, the exhibit catalog, and I would just spend hours looking through that thing. So that really inspired me to be interested in museums and in archaeology.
Very good. Another good question. Will this exhibit travel anywhere?
We don't have any plans at the moment for that, but it's possible. I mean, we can definitely think about that. Like if somebody approaches us, if another museum approaches us, we are open to that a lot of times. So.
Do you have any connection with the OPB Oregon experience, the suffragists? Did you have any input into that?
No, I didn't work on that, but I know some of our advisors on the group and on the project did, and we have very close ties with them. They use a lot of our images from our library and documents from our library and that kind of thing. So they do a lot of research with us.
And say one more time, where did you research to get this?
I did a lot of research just in our own library at OHS, but then I also went to University of Oregon, the archives there, and I did some research there. And then also worked with some other archives like the Lewis and Clark College archives and the State of Oregon archives, and the Library of Congress as well. So.
Went to the Library of Congress?
I didn't go to the Library of Congress, but
I did that virtually, huh?
Yeah, on their database. So.
Okay. Well, it looks like we're running out of questions. Do you have any questions for us? We've got a lot of amazing women. And when you reminded me of many of our members, the one I was closest to is Cappy Eaton, who when I asked her one time in the 90s, because she had been a league member since the 50s. So in the 90s, she was verging on 50 years, and she ended up being almost a 70-year member. But she was our lobbyist, and she kept going and going and going. So, 50, 60 years of doing this work. And I said, how can you do this? How can you just keep going? And she said, somebody's got to do it. So I think that's true of a lot of other league women, and they're amazing. I got another question. Do other states have similar state-centric suffrage museums? Do you know of any that did that as well?
I know that there have been some, especially with the anniversary or the centennial last year, that there were some other exhibits, like a lot of different museums, like history museums did them, I think. So, and I know that the Library of Congress themselves had a big one. And I believe the Smithsonian, there may have been one at the Smithsonian as well. So.
Well, there are and have been a lot of persistent women.
Definitely. Which we're lucky to have them in the world, that's for sure.
That was great. So I think that was our last answer. Yeah, and I got a comment from somebody who says the Library of Congress does a great online presentation.
Yeah, so, they do have an online exhibit.
Lori, thank you so much for this. I know you'll see a lot of us as the year goes on in person up there. And thanks especially for your work to preserve and present the work of these persistent women. The League particularly appreciates your effort. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm honored to be able to tell these stories, and I'm very honored to be here. Thank you for all your work that you do.
Good, good. Thank you. Okay. Hope to see you soon. And to our viewers, don't forget to tune in for our next third Thursday in April. And our speaker then will be Todd Schneider. He's the Executive Director of Community Supported Shelters, pre-housing shelter services for people in homelessness. You've seen the Conestoga little homes. Okay. We'll see you next month, I hope. Onward in good health and stay that way. Thank you. Bye-bye.